I'm actually going to really try to talk about the relationship between walking and public transportation, which I find quite fascinating, and so this conference made me think about it a bit more than I did before. The picture I chose here, by the way, this is a bus stop, just in case you guys missed it. I hope people know the reference. It's from the great movie North by Northwest. It's one of Hitchcock's best movies. This is Cary Grant, kind of not exactly waiting for a bus, but waiting by the bus stop, and then the bus comes. We'll see in a minute. He didn't walk there. He was dropped off, and that's really the way it works in many places which are not very transit-oriented. So let's start by talking about the synergy between walking and public transportation. So as I said, Cary Grant was dropped off, and then this is when the bus actually comes. As you can see, there's no way anybody's going to walk and catch this bus. Everybody has to be brought by car. Luckily, historically speaking, walking and public transportation are actually very intimately linked. I mean, because that's obviously the logic of using public transport. You don't have your own means of transportation, therefore you have to walk and catch some form of public transport. So usually the transit stops are embedded in very walkable areas, because that's a whole point. Over time, with kind of the elevated trains and so on, the relationship got a bit more complex. But generally speaking, in the best cities, there's still that intimate relationship between the walking environment here in Paris, sidewalks and so on, and the transit stop, which could be a metro stop, same in Bilbao, Santiago, or, of course, nothing could be more intimate than a bus stop. Bus stop is literally right there on the sidewalk, and you just hop on the bus or on the tram, and off you go in public transport. So that relationship, and this is a BRT station in Bogota, with the introduction of it's a bit like the elevated trains. BRT has this presence that's a bit more complex, and the pedestrian access to it is sometimes a little bit more elaborate, as we'll see in a minute. But generally speaking, you always walk to the stop. So the potential conflict also comes with the fact that mass transit needs to have a lot of capacity. So with the introduction of elevated trains, mass transit infrastructure on occasion became a bit of a pedestrian barrier. So in cities, you have conditions like this, which may be an impediment to movement, or at the very least, here in Hong Kong, the previous one was New York, an unpleasant presence on the street, which means it somehow degrades the pedestrian environment while providing vital service. So there is this kind of duality between the two. In Tokyo and in Berlin, they've done a good job at integrating some of those elevated infrastructures into the urban fabric, and in a way kind of making the pedestrian environment more pleasant, even if they are still a bit of a barrier. I have to note that this is a BRT station in Guangzhou, which does a very good job moving a lot of people very fast and very efficiently, but again, is a bit of an impediment to movement. As you can see, some of those stations are 300 meters long, and they are a pedestrian barrier in that sense. So, and that's what it looks like at street level. As you can see, not the most pleasant or pedestrian-friendly presence, again, while still providing transit opportunities for people who come by foot. I know I'm going to make some enemies by saying this, but bikes are sometimes a pedestrian problem as well. I mean, bike traffic and bike parking are sometimes difficult to cross, and there has to be a careful balance between the provision of bike lanes and bike parking in a dense urban environment that's supposed to also support pedestrians, not least in a place like Hong Kong. And I've had these sorts of arguments with some people in Hong Kong before. I do think that the balance needs to be thought out very carefully, as this picture illustrates. And then there is a very interesting case of really big transportation facilities, and that's very important. I mean, again, they are vital elements in the urban transport mobility, but for pedestrians and urbanistically, they form sometimes very hard barriers. This is the two train stations in Paris, Gare du Nord and Gare de l'Est. As you can see, very typical of 19th century stations. While there's a very kind of good urban fabric and very pedestrian-friendly urban fabric in front of the station, the sides tend to be sterilized and become a bit of a movement impediment. So this is the front, again, very pedestrian-friendly. And then if you look at the sides, you can see there are those, sometimes there are buildings, but generally speaking, they are impenetrable to pedestrians, and in that sense, there is that relationship that's a bit problematic. Grand Central Station in New York, one of my favorite transit facilities anywhere in the world. By the way, I didn't say, I wasn't introduced. Where's Danny? Thank you, Danny, for introducing me. I'm an architect also who does transportation facilities, and hence, you know, my topic. But anyway, so Grand Central, which is my favorite transportation facility, solved that problem through the ingenious concept of burying all the tracks underground, putting the head house above ground, and then what you see here is the day when it opened, you see all these gaps. These are essentially what are now streets, were originally basically holes that look down into the rail yard. And over time, they got filled in. So all these buildings actually have the tracks beneath them. The result being that the area around Grand Central is completely pedestrian friendly. You can see it. It's just one block in a city, in a very walkable city, which is Manhattan, while providing this enormous facility, train facility underneath, unlike those train stations in Paris. So that's a great example of how it was done at that point in New York. Unfortunately, in China today, train stations are built a little bit like airports, which are really inaccessible to pedestrians. In fact, to access most train stations in China, you're better off taking the metro or a bus or a taxi or a car and being dropped off at the station, because walking to the station is extremely challenging. And unless we feel somehow superior to mainland China, as some people in Hong Kong sometimes do, our own MTR developments, I'm sorry to say, are often also designed and built as fortresses which are inaccessible to pedestrians and can only be accessed typically by transit. Sometimes transit does the opposite. Instead of being a barrier, it becomes a connector. Andrew just spoke about the new stations in the West Island Line extension. My favorite example is in Dubai, when they opened the first metro line. It immediately solved what still is a big problem, which is this completely uncrossable road called Sheikh Zayed Road. Now you can cross it without getting into, this is a metro station, but the bridge is free, and in that sense provided a vital connection, very much like, I'm sorry to repeat what Andrew just showed, and I hope I'm not running into any copyright issues with this, but yeah. But this is a celebration of the same principle. By the way, the first one in Hong Kong that did this, that does it still today, is Sheung Station, which allows you to cross Connaught Road from Shun Tak Center to the other side of Sheung Wan, otherwise intraversable, except for through some pedestrian bridges. So the choices. How far do we walk? I mean, there's all sorts of theories about how far people are willing to walk in their daily lives. I'm not talking now about the Fitbit crowd, by the way. Here's one. I'm talking about people who just walk, you know, to get from point A to point B. Whether it's, you know, there's a theory, like if it's a comfortable environment, people walk for 20 minutes, fine. If it's like this, New York, Tokyo, Paris, Seattle, Buenos Aires, and so on, people will walk. If it's like this, maybe not. So, you know, one of the problems we have in Hong Kong is that because of the walking environment is so challenged for all sorts of reasons, because it's crowded, because we have all these barriers like railings. That's, you know, I'm not going to talk about too much, but I think people know the problem in Hong Kong. We have these bridges that force you to go up and down and are kind of sterile. We have these mean tunnels, or we have all these commercial spaces you have to walk through. I don't think that people in Hong Kong necessarily would choose to walk for 20 minutes because it's not like walking in Paris for 20 minutes or in Tokyo. So we have this issue. As an example, I mean, kind of interesting, I didn't realize WalkScore arrived in Hong Kong. Apparently, we are in a walker's paradise here in the convention center. it's well, not quite, as anybody who tried to walk last night to the venue where we had our reception could see. But I did an interesting comparison between walking the same distance in New York and in Hong Kong from here. So let's start from New York, Grand Central Station to the Empire State Building, about 800 meters. There is any number of ways you can take that route. And of course, that's because Manhattan is a very walkable environment, all street level, wide sidewalks, and so on. So this is one way of doing it, and then there is another way, and there is, probably, an infinite number of ways of doing it. Hong Kong, different story. If we start from here, Hong Kong Convention Exhibition Center, want to go to Pacific Place, which is also 800 meters. We actually looked very carefully, and we found two ways of doing it. Well, let's first record the problem. The problem is these are the railings. These are the limited crosswalks. These are the footbridges. So, option A, you can see this. And this, probably anybody who took that walk yesterday to Hai San Place will recognize the kind of the tortured journey with, lots of 90-degree turns and going up and down stairs and so on. And here's option B. Yeah, they're both about equal in terms of their inconvenience. What I do, faced with these options, actually, I opt for mass transit. So I just walk to Connaught Road, Harcourt Road, and then I take bus 104, which is my favorite bus in Hong Kong, which provides a very good service, drops you off right in front of Pacific Place. And honestly speaking, that's in a city that's like this, again, Santiago, you can take the metro, or you can say it's a nice day, sidewalks are pleasant, the weather is nice, I'm going to walk. In Hong Kong, you're almost always, when faced with the options, actually hopping on the bus, even if it's to cover a distance that normally you might walk, you opt for the bus or the MTR, depending on how far you go. So that's one of the issues we have here in Hong Kong. Now, when we take transit, it's an interesting issue because there's a lot of theories. I mean, there are numbers that tossed around. One is, well, people refer to the last mile, which in metric countries is the last kilometer. Never mind that there's quite a bit of a difference between a mile and kilometer. Then there is a 400-meter rule, which people, it's kind of a number that, again, in the US it's referred to as, 1,500 feet. How far will people walk to the next transit stop as a way of, as an indication of the required density of transit networks? I think that the rule of thumb is probably between 5 and 10 minutes people are willing to walk to get to a transit stop. And it would be different if it was a train or a bus, and we can talk about it for the rest of the day, but let's just look at a few examples. Paris has a very kind of pretty consistent distribution of metro access, which is reflected in the map, and you can see is very much kind of a mapping of the urban fabric, which is also very consistent. So you have pretty good access, and you're within kind of, there's a metro stop kind of pretty much anywhere you go within the center of Paris. Tokyo is a bit of a different story. Tokyo has those wonderful high-density hubs, which are, people know Tokyo, it's around the Yamanote line, that circles around Tokyo. It does have a very, very impressive, probably the biggest rail network in the world, but Tokyo, aside for those big hubs, is actually quite low density. So the distribution of stations, at least rail stations in Tokyo, is not that, they're not as close or as closely as packed together as they are in Paris. But walking to transit in Tokyo is, at least in my view, a very pleasant experience because there's all these charming alleyways and so on. So you might walk longer than 5 to 10 minutes in Tokyo and not suffer for it. Of course, you can always take a bus, and that's always an option in Tokyo as well as elsewhere. You look at Hong Kong, it's a different story altogether. The MTR, as Andrew just showed us, started as an urban metro system, which was kind of built under an existing urban area with stations that pop up the way they do in Paris and in Santiago and in Tokyo and so on. Over time, though, the model had evolved into what's called actually an MTR development, which is these kind of red-hot development clusters, which provide a concentration of everything, basically built around the metro station. So those of you who are not native to Hong Kong, I guess most of you aren't. And by the way, if I can plug my own tour, also it's Friday morning, I will show you how it really works. There's not going to be much art. There's going to be a lot of gray stations. But honestly, it's a very interesting difference between how the MTR functions in Hong Kong in the old parts and in the new parts, in particular in relation to pedestrian movement. So in the old parts, the connection is very organic the way it is in many cities around the world. In the new parts, it's very much designed around these stations. It's, those clusters all reflect a concentration of uses around the MTR station. You have the commerce, you have the residential, and it's all connected through a very particular pedestrian network, and that's what we'll see on Friday. And this is what I call not transit-oriented development, but transit-dependent development, and that's it's interesting. And we can talk about that, as an issue. I mean, some urbanists don't like it because we don't see the street level and so on. But actually, people like living that way. We'll touch on it a bit more in a second. So we did a very quick exercise, try to compare transit and walking time between Hong Kong, New York, Mexico City, a city that we do a lot of work in Paris, and came to a very simplistic and non-scientific conclusion, which is in Hong Kong, if you take a journey, and the journey includes walk, wait, take the train or the bus, whatever it is, and then walk to your destination. So it's a complete the sequence of walking in transit. In Hong Kong, the share of walking is the smallest of all those cities. We took 16 random routes in each one of the cities, and that was kind of the again, non-scientific conclusion, which is kind of interesting and kind of proves something, which is in Hong Kong, actually, you're never very far from transit. So the walking to transit and from transit part is actually very, very short in Hong Kong, which serves us well because walking, as I have hinted, and will probably hint a bit more, is not the most pleasant experience, whereas transit is. So there you go. So again, as I said, that's how people choose to live in Hong Kong. Very convenient, very short walking distance from home to transit, from shop to transit, and on the other end from work to transit. So, and then let's talk about transfer. This is just talking a little bit about what I do. So we design transportation hubs mostly. I mean, you also do airports, but that's a different presentation, which I'll do another time in the conference Fly21. Transit stations, intermodal hubs are very interesting creatures in that they are a place where different modes of transit are co-located and people have to move between them. What we try to do is make that experience as pleasant as possible. Some years ago, we did a comparison between a transit station in Beijing and a transit station in Hong Kong. What we're showing here, it's kind of an analysis of level of service in a slightly expanded way than level of service is measured by some of the sort of academic literature. Suffice it to say that in the end, the MTR, we looked at Hong Kong Station, it did much better than the station in Beijing, except when it got to the intermodal connection to buses, and we touched on it a little bit before. Andrew conceded that Singapore does it better than Hong Kong. I think Hong Kong does it pretty badly for reasons that we can get into maybe in the discussion afterwards. So what we do, this is an intermodal hub that we are working on right now in Mexico City. It's a commercial development, but involves several modes of transport. We have an intercity bus terminal. We have BRT. We have local bus terminal, of course, taxis and so on, and then we have metro underneath. What we do is actually test each one of the intermodal routes to make sure that they provide as consistent a level of service as possible. The target is C, level of service C, again, is measured through metrics that go beyond the academic definition of level of service C. The only place where we fail, so to speak, or we provide slightly lower level of service is stairs going down. That was a client's choice, the client being the city in this case. That going down does not require escalators, so there's a slight inconvenience there. Of course, elevators are always provided for the disabled. Finally, let's look at the alternative. I think it's obvious to all of us, the American dream that became the Chinese dream, and then the Indian dream, and it's everybody's nightmare. So we all understand that the choice to walk to transit, and to use intermodal transit transfers is a choice that people have to make, and we need to make it the choice that they do make as opposed to sitting in their car. And I have to say, this as a closing note, careful what you wish for. We'll talk about the future. It's not directly related to anything that I said, but I just want to say self-driving cars are not the future. And I think they're highly problematic to pedestrians, and I want everybody here to think about that. Because the way I see it, the only way they're going to work without the kind of dangers that interface with pedestrians will cause is by forcing all of us even more of these kind of complete separations between vehicular traffic and pedestrians. So that's my closing note. Careful what you wish for. Thank you.